And hello, good morning. Thanks for organizing and thanks all for being here. I'll share some of my work with you on the user profiles. Who are the ones that are likely to share or that state that they are willing to share, and why do they do this? I'm Lars Bocker at Oslo University, but previously worked at Utrecht, and I did this in collaboration with colleagues from Utrecht University, also present here. So the sharing economy, I'll keep it very brief because we had already a good introduction in the plenary lecture, but it's not new, but the sharing economy in its current, as it currently manifests itself, has developed rapidly, also maybe driven by economic and environmental crises, but definitely enabled by all kind of ICT advancements and the rise of platforms. And a lot of benefits are communicated in this rhetoric of the sharing economy. The utilization of idle capacities is one of them. That leads to resource efficiency, or could lead to resource efficiency. Economic savings for individuals, for users, but also for those who rent out their houses. Local community effects could strengthen local ties, social cohesion, and social empowerment of disadvantaged groups. But as we've also heard, and I've read extensively, there are these benefits are often unfounded, and empirical research that comes up now, and I think is very important, shows also that not always these benefits are actually there. So there is some controversy around the sharing economy, and I'll leave this part because we've heard a lot about it. But policymakers, they need answers because it's rapidly rising, and they want to know what do we need to do with it. They contact us, or especially Koen also, quite often about these kind of issues. And I think a lot of it is also related to a lack of publicly funded empirical knowledge on what actually happens here. Especially when you look, for instance, at car sharing, we see quite a bit of knowledge based on data commissioned by car sharing firms, but publicly funded empirical research is still lacking often. And in particular, the role of the user, which I will address more closely in this topic, in this presentation, is underexplored. And then there is also the lack of comparison between sharing sectors. The sharing economy is often talked about as if it's one thing, but there are completely different types of products and services, and they maybe have different. People may have maybe different people sharing these, but also may have different motivations to do so. So, who shares what and why? We look at peer-to-peer sharing of different types of goods and services. Car sharing, but also car ride sharing, accommodation sharing, the classic example of the power drill, meal sharing, and garden sharing. Actually, these are chosen also because they all have this notion of idle capacity in it. You could also argue that there are other things you can share, services, etc., but they are excluded here because we just look at goods. So two main questions: the willingness to share. What are the effects of social demographics, environmental consciousness, pro-social orientation, and neighborhood attachment on the willingness to consume and supply shared goods and services? So on the one hand, the social demographic profile, on the other hand, a set of mediators for which we want to figure out how do they affect the willingness to consume and share. The willingness, indeed, this is a stated preference research. We don't have data on actual shares, but we look at the general population. And we want to see, are these typical early adopters that state that they are willing to share? or is it maybe a more diverse population? And can we identify some empowerment of marginalized groups? Or is it perhaps more a reproduction of existing social or existing digital divide? Maybe the access is mostly granted to those, or the potential is mostly seen by those who already have. To study this, we had the Stated Adaptation Survey amongst 1330 respondents in Amsterdam. And we use structural equation modeling, very simplified figure to look at the effect of social demographics directly measured and the effects on the willingness to share, but also how they run via three mediators, like what I mentioned. To look at the results, we see first some of the direct effects, that age has a negative effect on the overall willingness to share. So here we combined all the different sharing products together. And women are more likely to share than men. But for instance, also that non-Western people are actually more likely to share overall and higher educated. They are also more likely to share. But income, surprisingly, has no effect, and also family type not. But when we look at the direct effects, they are rather small, but most of the effects are mediated by environmental. You see the width of the arrow sort of identify how strong the effects are. You see especially environmental consciousness measured based on several items. That is really strongly affecting the willingness to consume in the sharing economy. And also a pro-social attitude or pro-social orientation is also a strong benefit strongly the willingness to consume in the sharing economy. And neighborhood effects, on the other hand, do not have a significant effect in overall consumption of shared goods, but they do in some categories. So this was the overall picture, but we look at the different categories, and we see that some of them are, look descriptively, are shared more than others, such as the drill is people are very much willing to share that, whereas meal and garden sharing, perhaps also because they are less well known, but they are, for instance, less shared. But this is the consumption side. But there is also the supply side, which is important in peer-to-peer sharing. You need to have people that actually offer their own goods. And then you see a rather similar picture with one major exception, that's accommodation. There are very few people that actually want to share their own house. Well, if we look at the multivariate results, they confirm sort of, first of all, that over the board, you see that environmental orientation and pro-social behavior, they have a positive effect on sharing, both consumption and supply. But neighborhood attachment had not much of an effect, but one I can highlight that's maybe interesting to see is that when you look at accommodation sharing, a neighborhood attachment has actually a negative effect on that people actually put their own house offer their own house for sharing, and this might have to do with if a neighborhood is perceived as homogeneous, or if there is a lot of cohesion, then perhaps people think twice to put their house on the market, because maybe they think about their neighbors also. This might be one reason for that. I think I'll move a bit further. We can look at it in more detail later. But when the second question we want to address is motivations to share. So what are the motivations to consume and supply in the sharing economy, and how do these differ between different population categories and between different sectors of the sharing economy? In particular, we want to look at intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. So There is also a more recent debate on that again in the literature. Same data set, but this time only those who report to be willing or highly willing to participate. And this is an ordinal logistic regression, a very simplified form. It's the social demographics and the sectors of the sharing economy, and then the motivation to supply and consume. What we see is when you look at different age and gender categories, it's distributed over environmental, social, and financial motivations. They're all relatively in the center, but younger people in the top, they have more financial motivations than the other ones. And then when you look at the supply side, the whole group actually went down a little bit, which means that financial motivations over the board are less important, and environmental and social aspects more. Then when you look at different income and education, you see a similar picture, but they are rather clustered. But again, when you look at supply, the whole cluster moves down, so the financial motivations are again less important. But more interestingly, when you look at different sectors, we see that, for instance, meal sharing, which is more of a socially motivated, whereas very much material aspects such as car sharing, they don't have so much of this social motivation, but they have more of a balance between financial and environmental motivations. And when you look at supply, so this is the supply, you see that actually everything is more intrinsically motivated by environmental or by social aspects, except really the home, and that we've already heard before that there's a lot of financial gain to be made there, so the financial motive is very strong amongst that small part of the population that actually is willing to share their home. I'll skip these and I'll move to the conclusion. Environmental consciousness and pro-social orientation, they have large positive effects on sharing. And the neighborhood attachment has not over the board, but for instance affects some parts of it, like accommodation sharing. User and supplier profiles, they are not like per se the kind of early adopter. We don't necessarily see that. They are rather socio-demographically diverse. For instance, we saw a higher probability of sharing amongst non-Western groups. Supplying is what we saw in the triangles is more intrinsically motivated, especially by social motivations, whereas consumption more for financial reasons. And yeah, most importantly, there is not really one single sharing economy. We see a lot of difference between the goods and services and the sectors, and both in the willingness to share and in the underlying motivations. So next important steps are really, because this is stated preference data, to also have this with real sharers and to see like, okay, because these people give us an idea that how much are they willing to share, but to see how it's actually shared might give a different picture. And also to look at the geography of this, to look at how is it spatially distributed between cities or within cities, or between different countries. And finally to look at the user practices, and from that also like all the environmental impacts, like how do people actually use the sharing, how often, and how do they substitute other practices, for instance in travel behavior or in consumption behavior that they used to do before. So these kind of issues need to be further addressed, and I think we are already making some progress here in this workshop. I see a lot of stuff on that coming up, so thanks for listening, and if you have any questions, please feel free.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll start with Adrien.
Thank you for this presentation. It's very interesting to see that you use the same framework for supply and demand. So I was wondering, do you assume that there is a certain level of permeability or similarity between suppliers and users on those platforms, sharing platforms?
We look at the supply and demand in separate models. Actually, we want also to see if there are differences there. So for each category, we basically have the model on how do people respond in terms of consumption and how do they respond in terms of supply. And when you look also at the pictures that we see here, this is the general tendency to participate. You see also the differences.
But are these the same persons?
They're the same persons,
Yeah.
but they answer the question twice.
Is there a high correlation between those willing to supply and those willing to consume?
Okay, we have to. That's. Oh, sorry, I didn't get your question correctly. That would be interesting to look at. I think I'll make a note. Yeah.
Okay, just one thing that strikes me. Did you check for political orientation? Because if you say social and environmental orientation versus neighborhood attachment, that sounds to me pretty much like a left green towards a conservative orientation. So, you know, all the age groups and stuff, this would be sort of all fall down on a political gradient, wouldn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, unfortunately, we have no data in the questionnaire on political party membership, etc. But I think, especially if you want to analyze these kind of things on a neighborhood level, and you want to use statistics of the neighbors, you could do that. And if you want to replicate this study, it would be maybe a good one to also ask these kind of questions. Thanks. Yeah.
So it's interesting that you find no effects of neighborhood attachment. Well, we find clear effects of neighborhood cohesion on actual behavior. While you study intentions. Do you have any idea where that difference comes from?
I think we see some effects for some categories, but most of the sharing categories that we look at, not all of them are necessarily only in the neighborhood, but perhaps also there is the difference between the stated intentions and what people actually do. That this gives a different picture. This is research done in Amsterdam, only in Amsterdam. That perhaps can also make a difference. I don't know exactly what the study.
That was my other point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
But Amsterdam people are nice people.
Yes.
Sorry.
So what might be missing in this slide is, or in this data, is the price. So, for example, in accommodation, the price might be too low. So everybody likes to go and consume, but nobody likes to offer at that price.
The exchange of to what extent people are willing to share, we didn't define like a price. We just defined like, would you be able to rent it out or to but here I think the issue of accommodation, you can actually get a lot to rent out your accommodation, and people generally know that also. I think it's mostly related to the fact that you don't want to offer your house and give up. Yeah, it's very there are a lot of trust issues there perhaps, and I think that's the most important. But what we see is that, especially with accommodation, which is such a high value commodity, or there you see that financial motivations are also the strongest. So people are really conscious of, and especially the ones that actually supply are stating to supply their house. They are really conscious about the financial incentive to gain from it.
Well, I think you have a good point, because depending on your neighborhood, the expected return can be very different in Amsterdam. So if you don't expect a high return, you may not be willing to rent it. See what I mean?
Yeah.
So if we have address information, we may have to add that.
Yeah, we could give
Yeah.
that a try.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks.
So if there are no further questions, we can go to the last speaker of the session. Thanks.